at Knolls. Their speech is about censorship in educational environments. This speech discusses the history of censorship, current censorship in the United States, and its effects on children. Ezra was inspired to do a speech about this topic given the recent rise in discrimination.
Imagine a world where knowledge is restricted, where the general population has no idea about the reality of world events, where education is so regulated and controlled that people don't even know what learning is, where even being interested in learning is a crime. This is the reality of George Orwell's novel 1984. But it's not just a Times 100 bestseller. It's also a warning against the censorship of knowledge. Censorship is the suppression of materials often targeting one group of people. Censoring education by banning books has a detrimental effect on children and their development. Today, we will first look at the history of censorship worldwide, current censorship in the United States, and finally at the modern implications of these bans. Book bans and other bans on education are nothing new. One of the many reasons Orwell wrote 1984, published in 1949, was to warn against the censorship of knowledge. His book makes a direct reference to 1930s and 1940s Nazi Germany, where books were banned for promoting un-German ideals. Famous authors like Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud had their books banned and burned in mass book burning events. And unfortunately, the old saying by German writer Heinrich Heine became a reality. Where one burns books, one will soon burn people. In the US, censorship is often viewed as violating the First Amendment and people's rights to free speech, but that hasn't been enough to stop censorship throughout the centuries. From the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s, anti-literacy laws, specifically in the South, made it illegal for enslaved or free people of color to read and write. Later, the Comstock Act of 1873 made it illegal to distribute any obscene materials through the mail. Authors like Margaret Sanger, who wrote a magazine column focused on teaching women about their bodies and birth control, were arrested under this law. But it hasn't just been state and federal governments that have historically censored. Local school districts have too. In the historic case Tinker versus Des Moines, 3 students were expelled after wearing black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. The Supreme Court ruled against the school's unfair restriction of the students' right to freedom of expression, saying the First Amendment protects students' rights to express political and social views. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a rise in censorship specifically against the LGBTQ community in the United States. The U.S. state of Florida has been one of the largest perpetrators of this trend. Beginning on June 1st, 2022, HB 1557, otherwise known as the Don't Say Gay law, has been in effect in Florida. This law is incredibly vague with its wording, but the message is clear. Don't mention anything regarding the LGBTQ community, or risk face up to 5 years in prison. The vagueness of this law puts the burden on educators to try and figure out what is prohibited and what is acceptable, or risk facing jail time. But prior to that, in 2021, the group Moms for Liberty was founded in Florida by 3 women, 2 former Board of Education members, and 1 current member. From their website, you can read their mission, which is Moms for Liberty is dedicated to fighting for the survival of America by unifying, educating, and empowering parents to defend their parental rights on all levels of government. But exactly what are parental rights? In education, parents' rights mean that the parent has to say what their child's being taught. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the policies that groups like Moms for Liberty push are centered around censoring the views of people they don't agree with, people such as the LGBTQ community. They actively push for book bans in schools and libraries. They ban books such as Genderqueer, a memoir by Maya Kobe, which is an autobiography exploring self-identity, and Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which is another autobiography exploring the author's life growing up as a lesbian. In fact, according to the American Library Association, Genderqueer was the most banned book of 2022. Actually, 7 out of the 13 most challenged books in 2022 contained LGBTQ content. These books all share the key themes of growing up as a member of the LGBTQ community. And these are the books that advocates for parental rights don't want in schools. But it's not just LGBTQ topics at risk. Actual educational courses are too. Let's take a moment to go back to the Sunshine State, Florida, where they've banned educational courses such as AP Psychology. AP Psych is a very beneficial course for understanding the human mind. But for Florida, the course's section on gender and sexuality goes against state laws. They also push for teaching incorrect statements about the history of the United States. House Bill 7 in Florida restricts what topics can be taught in schools, topics such as race. The problems of this law can be clearly shown with this one Floridian textbook excerpt about teaching Rosa Parks. According to the textbook, Rosa Parks showed courage. One day, she rode a bus. She was told to move from her seat. She did not. She did what she believed was right, completely omitting her race and reasoning for not giving up her seat on the bus. Rosa Parks was a black woman and was integral to the Montgomery bus boycotts and the civil rights movement as a whole. This textbook excerpt is a clear example of censoring education to fit in with one narrow-minded view. And at least in the case of Rosa Parks, key details are left out of the story. We've talked about education and how it's being censored across the United States. What effects does this have? What does pushing book bans against one group of people mean for our nation as a whole? Let's start with the youngest people, the people most affected by these book bans and educational censorships, children. All children are detrimentally affected by these book bans. They're not being exposed to new ideas from a young age. But not just that, LGBTQ children, or children with LGBTQ parents, are heavily affected by these laws. Imagine a child with gay parents seeing And Tango Makes Three, a book about gay penguins that was also based off a true story, and feeling connected to it, because they also have two dads. But then in the new school year, that child can no longer access that book, because it's one of the many books that advocates for parental rights don't want in schools. That child will feel even more isolated and alone now that they can't access that book, a book that represents them. The message being sent is clear, that that child is wrong, that this book is wrong, and that their family is wrong. That child will feel even more isolated and alone thanks to these advocates for parental rights. But not just emotionally. Psychologically, children are heavily affected by these book bans. According to Dr. Bash of New Directions Mental Health, marginalized people are already at risk for negative mental health consequences due to their experiences with discrimination, like censorship. Exposure to other ways of life is natural and needed for children to grow up and be functional and accepting members of society. But with these educational censorships, children won't get that. Instead, they'll be exposed to only a narrow-minded view in their most formative years. That's not to say that people can't change their views in adulthood, but teaching children that other people exist and that's okay creates a more inclusive world that we always strive to create. In the US, limiting access to books about the LGBTQ community isolates people further. Children are growing up with an accepting worldview because books meant to teach children that other people exist have been effectively banned by removing them from schools and libraries. In the future, this could create a society that has only a narrow-minded view on what is prohibited and what is acceptable. And our country could look more and more like the dystopian world of 1984. Today, we discussed the history of censorship worldwide, current censorship in the United States, and finally at the modern implications these bans have on children. There's always hope to change the future, so let's hope we can change it before it's too late.